I work at a half-priced voodoo shop. Part 3. What would you do if you got held up at work? Like at gunpoint and some coked up junkie is screaming at you to give him all of the money in the register. Hold your hands up and comply? Try and be a hero and fight him off with a bat or a gun hidden under the counter? I always thought that I would just give the guy the cash register and hold my hands up while he left with it. That was until I got held up not once, but twice in the same week. The first time, I got to work on time, looking around to make sure King Creole wasn't hiding behind some corner that I didn't even know existed in the shop. Satisfied that my boss wasn't going to scare me, I walked over to the counter and stabbed my needle into the counter doll, taking a seat on my stool and sighing as I started my shift, drumming my fingers up and down the counter. Normally, I would see at most 4 or 5 customers during my entire shift. Most wanted a wish, much to my chagrin, and maybe 1 or 2 of them wanted a potion. That's a simple procedure. You ask for the potion, and I ring you up. Easy as that. I don't have to clean anything, and I don't have to help discard a body. But unfortunately for me, not many people want a potion. They'd rather try and wish for something. So when a guy came in wearing a beanie and a hoodie, I was more than willing to bet that he was going to ask for a wish. I barely opened my mouth to talk to him when a gun was shoved right in my face. By reflex, I almost put my hands up slowly. "Easy, man," I said in a squeaky, surprised voice. "Don't try and say that you wouldn't react the same way." "Shut up. Is it just you in here?" the guy asked, his eyes darting everywhere in a paranoid state. He was obviously on something. He had to be, to try and rob a place that looked abandoned 90% of the time. I think my boss is here, and that thing in the basement, but I'm pretty sure I can't get out." I motioned my head over to the shut basement door, which of course at this time was not being banged on or crying or screaming was heard. The guy, obviously unamused, shoved the gun further into my face. "Get your boss out here before I blow your fucking brains all over the wall," he threatened, cocking the hammer back on his revolver. "Okay, just chill, man," I said, putting my hands up higher as I backed up and started making my way over to the boss man's office. Lucky the guy was so busy focused on me, because believe me when I say that the dolls on the wall behind him looked like they wanted to jump down and rip him to shreds. Making it to King Creole's office, I quickly knocked on it, looking back at the guy who was staring at the counter doll. I imagine he had the look on him that he gives me when I'm slacking off on my phone. "Travis, what do you want?" Creole's voice came from the office, the door opening and him looking down at me, then over at the guy holding up the establishment. His smile lowered a bit, but it didn't falter. Instead, he nodded knowingly and stepped out, fixing his dark purple tie and walking over to the counter with me next to him. "Jesus!" the robber gasped when he saw King Creole coming towards him. A pretty normal response when seeing my boss for the first time. The man didn't falter for too long, though, pointing the gun up at the lanky voodoo shop owner. "What can I do for you?" Creole asked with a hum, hands clasped together as he looked down at the robber, not an ounce of concern on that chalky white face of his. "Open up the register in the safe," the robber said quickly, looking back at the door, then back to us, the gun firmly in his hands and a serious look on his face. "Well, I don't have a safe, but if it's the register you want, Travis would be more than willing to open it for you. Right, Travis, my boy?" he asked me, giving me a hard smack on my back and sending me stumbling forward. The robber nearly shot me on the spot as I did so. My hand still up, and I looked back to Creole like he was sending me to the slaughter. Well, if he wanted to get robbed, I really couldn't stop him. I walked back behind the counter and opened up the register, and one look at it told me that it was way more full than usual. I could say that for a fact because when I opened it up, the thing shot some loose bills up into the air, and my eyes were as wide as the robber's, who quickly pushed me aside and started filling up his hoodie and pants pockets with all the cash from the register. "Now, Kevin," King Creole's voice hummed, in a tone that I knew meant trouble, the one he used when persuading someone into wishing for something. I started instinctively backing away from him as he kept shoving bills into his pockets. He did look up, though, obviously confused as to how the Voodoo man knew his name. "How the hell do you know my name?" the robber, who I guessed was indeed named Kevin, asked, pointing a gun at King Creole, who didn't flinch as he walked over to him. The robber was obviously freaked out, the gun shaking in his hand. "Didn't your mama ever teach you that stealing is very bad?" Creole asked, raising a gloved finger and shaking it at Kevin, who shivered and started sweating as he backed away from the man. "And didn't anyone ever tell you not to play with guns?" he asked. Kevin looked at me, his eyes wide with fear as he pointed the shaking revolver forward. A loud crack went off in the shop. My own eyes were wide as my ears rang, seeing that Kevin had pulled the trigger on my boss. I looked over to King Creole, who staggered to a stop, his head jerking backwards and the stitches holding his head on almost snapping off. "Oh, Kevin, Kevin, Kevin." His voice still rang, causing both mine and Kevin's jaw to hit the floor. Creole jerked his head back into place, only this time there was an obvious bullet hole in his forehead. "Looks like I'll have to teach you a lesson," he chuckled. Kevin then started backing up, dropping the gun to the floor and holding his hands up. I, meanwhile, looked over at Creole, completely dumbfounded. I, at this point, had figured that he wasn't really human, but surviving a headshot really kind of solidified that in my own mind. I looked over at the register and saw that it was still very much full of cash. A never-ending cash register. Another perk to working here, I guess. "Travis, do be a good boy and look away, please," King Creole asked me as he closed the distance to Kevin, grabbing the robber by the throat and lifting him up off of the floor. "I don't want you to watch this part," he said sweetly, like a mom talking to her son about something. I opened my mouth to ask what was going to happen, but I thought better of it, turning around and looking at the wall behind me. Kevin, meanwhile, screamed and begged for me to help. Funny how that works. A couple of minutes ago he was holding me up, and now he's screaming at the top of his lungs to help him. Though it didn't last too much longer, since his screams turned into gurgles and hacking coughs. I did my best to ignore the increasingly wet and nasty slaps and rips coming from behind me. I'm gonna be honest, the fear of what he was doing to the robber was a million times scarier than the act of actually being robbed. "All done," the satisfied hum of my boss rang in my ringing ears. I turned and saw the big splatter of blood on the wall and on the floor where Kevin had once been. Great. No doubt I would have to clean that up. "What did you do with him?" I asked the old Voodoo King. He looked at me with those big black button eyes of his and looked to his arm, which he brought up and showed me that he was holding a controller for a marionette doll. Except it was made of bones. Small bones that almost looked like some sort of animals. Of course, those thoughts were dispelled when he lifted his arm up further and produced a small bloody figure attached to the strings of the controller. I'm sure I don't need to spell out who the figure looked like. "I don't appreciate people threatening my employees," he sighed, dropping the bloody figure onto the table and made it dance around, making the counter messy with blood as he did so. I looked up to him, both thankful and pissed off, mostly because I figured I would have to clean all of this up. "Thank you, sir. Do you want me to—" I started, but was soon interrupted by him when he held his hand up, and a little figure mimicked him, Gotta hand it to him. He's a great puppeteer. Don't worry about the mess, Travis. He shrugged it off, chuckling as he picked up the figure and held it tightly clenched in his gloved hands, more blood leaking out of it and dripping onto the counter. Just get rid of this for me, please, he asked, tossing the gun at me. I fumbled with it, afraid that it was going to go off in my hands. But I was sure that it wouldn't go off, mostly because it was empty. I looked up at him, noticing the bullet hole in his forehead had disappeared. I didn't ask about that, though. I simply nodded and went over to the front door and left, walking across the street to a dumpster that is near our shop in the alley, tossing it in there after I wiped it down against my pants, just in case my fingerprints were there, and I quickly jogged back into the store, more than happy to see that not a speck was left where Kevin once was. That was the first time I was held up in the store. The second time came about 2 days later. I was working later than usual. My shift is usually from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. This time I was working from 5 to 9. Not horrible, but we definitely get weirder people in the later hours. Weird people are usually chill with King Creole, and the odd person asking for a wish or a potion. Well, this time, a fine gentleman came running into the store and hid behind a shelf that covered him from the view at the front door. I watched as he squatted even lower when a car drove past, shining a light into the shop and going along after a moment. The guy looked up for a minute and then over to me. Hey, do you need anything, or are you just here to loiter? I asked him. Look, I was tired, man, and I was like half an hour away from unpinning my needle from the doll. Mentally, I was checked out already. So when the guy pointed a gun at me, I actually rolled my eyes at him. Again? I thought as I put my hands up. I need a place to hide, the guy said quickly, looking back to the door and rushing over to me. The cops are after me, he said. And that's when I noticed the blood on his clothes. I sighed and looked over to King Creole's office, hoping he could handle this. Of course, when I turned back around and saw him right behind this guy, I nearly shat myself. What have we here? He asked, putting his hand on the other man's shoulder, flipping him around to face him. The man gasped and was quickly disarmed. Need a place to hide, son? What? He said in confusion, but in the mention of hiding, he quickly pulled out a switchblade, pointing it up at Creole. Where? I need it quick, man, he shouted, looking behind Creole to see if the cops were making another round. Why, right this way, sonny, my boss said with a happy tone, pulling the nameless man along towards the basement. Now that really sent my stomach down into a pit. At this point, I had gotten used to the basement creature, but seeing some unsuspecting person getting led there, I felt bad for the man. Faster, you freak! They could be here any minute, the man shouted, flinching at any little creak in the shop. Creole took his sweet time, pulling out the key and opening up the basement, pulling the door open and stepping aside like a grand unveiling. All yours, he hummed, watching with a wide smile as the man rushed into the dark basement, closing the door behind him and locking it. And that's that, he hummed, looking back at me with the same smile and walking over. What is down there, sir? I asked him, pointing at the basement door. Creole looked me dead in the eyes. I could tell he wasn't messing around just by the tone of his voice. None of your business, Travis, he said in an almost animal-like snarl. I swallowed the lump in my throat and backed up a bit, nodding at him and flinching hard when the door began to be banged on. Let me out! There's something down here! The man screamed, banging harder and harder on the door, the frame bending with just how hard he hit it. Of course, those soon turned into loud screams as I assumed whatever lived in the basement had caught up with him. King Creole looked back at the basement door and waited for it to stop banging. And soon enough it did, and we heard the sounds of something being dragged down the stairs. I looked at him then. A look of anger was on his pale face. the first time I had ever seen him like that. That whore gets what she deserves. He mumbled low enough to where I assume he thought I couldn't hear, but hear I did. I didn't say anything, wiping up the counter and unpinning my meal from the doll. "Good night, sir," I said as I took off my name tag and shoved it into my pocket. My words shook him from his angry spat, and he turned on his heels to look at me, a smile on his face once again. "Good night, Travis, my boy," he hummed, turning and walking back off to his office. I nodded and turned to leave myself. I stopped at the door, though, turning back and looking at the basement. I looked back over towards King Creole's office, and once I was sure he was in there, I made my way over to the door. I looked at it, noticing the blood coming from underneath the crack. I knelt and tried to peer through the keyhole. I didn't see anything at first, just the usual blackness of a basement. I sighed and stood to leave, until I heard a soft thud coming from the door. I turned and raised a brow at that. Leaning down again, I put my eye to the keyhole. This time, I was greeted by a green, shiny, cracked eye. Flinching hard, I backed up and quickly made my way out of the shop, shaking my head quickly and just getting out of there. I don't know what King Creole has down there, and I don't really want to know either, even if whatever it is keeps begging me to let it out. Hey there, everyone. I want to say thank you so much for clicking on my video and watching and listening to the story all the way through to the end. If you like what you heard, please hit subscribe and hit that notification bell. That way you get notified every time a new video comes out. And you're gonna want to know when they come out, because there are 4 more parts to this story coming up. This is absolutely one of my favorite stories of all time I have found on Reddit. It is just continually entertaining and makes more questions that I just want to be answered. So my question for you today is, what is in the basement? What did King Creole mean when he was talking about this, I suppose, woman? Why was he so angry? What is down there? Who is down there? Why is she making him so upset? How do you think Creole stays alive? I want to hear your thoughts, your opinions, and your theories down in the comment section below, and I will get back to you as soon as I possibly can if you have any questions or thoughts you want to share with me. So until next time, everybody, be safe out there.